Sir, I would like to introduce Dr. Beena ma'am. She is a controller of examination as well as professor of English in our department.
Hello, sir. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. That's an interesting combination, Professor of English and Controller of
Yeah,
Examinations.
you just can't. I mean, I'm sure you understand.
I absolutely do.
The misery that I'm going through, surrounded by numbers and percentages. So these sessions give me a welcome break.
No, I'm glad you're here then, and I'm glad you could make it, given your duties as CoE.
Sir, we also have with us Sompurba Basu. She is a research scholar in our department and she is also a teacher in Navodaya Vidyalaya.
Okay. Hello, Sompurva.
Hello, sir.
So, right, I was a bit apprehensive about Teams because I'm not a frequent user of Teams, but I guess it was pretty hassle-free to get in actually. Yeah.
It's quite friendly, sir.
Yeah.
So give me 2 minutes. Once you start, I'll
Sure,
make myself visible.
Yeah, same.
Thank you.
Same.
We'll take another 2 minutes.
Absolutely fine.
A very good morning to one and all who have joined us virtually on the first day of the 2-day International Multidisciplinary Conference on Representation of Violence in Literature and Media, conducted by REVA University. We are extremely delighted to organize this scholarly series of lectures by elite academicians and researchers on the topic Representation of Violence in Literature and Media. I, Sompurba Basu, research scholar from the School of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences, REVA University, and also the host for today's session, heartily welcomes you all to this virtual recondite. We are overwhelmed to receive a massive response from academia and researchers across the country for this FDP. Request you all to kindly switch off your video and audio during the session and maintain the decorum. In case of any concern and query, please contact the team organizing committee through the WhatsApp group. I would like to introduce you now to the moderator of the session, Dr. Beena G, who is currently the controller of examination, REVA University. She has been active in academia for over 28 years now. She has been the principal, REVA Group of Institutions, Associate Dean, School of Arts, Humanities, and School of Applied Sciences, REVA University. An eloquent and competent public speaker, a passionate teacher, a dynamic administrator and leader, she excels in the spheres of training, oratory, and team building. We welcome you, ma'am.
Thank you so much.
We express our extreme gratitude now to the resource person of today's session on disability and violence by Dr. Banibrata Mahanta, sir, who is the Professor of English Literature at Banaras Hindu University, India. He's a teacher and translator working in the areas of Indian writing in English, the development of Indian nationalist thought and literary theory, especially disability theory. His work is published in journals and edited volumes brought out by Routledge, Palgrave Macmillan, Springer, Bloomsbury, Rowman and Littlefield, Orient Black Swan and IIA's Shimla, as well as in the Hindu and the Outlook. We extend a warm welcome to you, sir. We are fortunate to have such a brilliant and magnanimous person as a speaker of today's session, who will be delivering his insightful talk on disability and violence. Now, without any further delay, I request Dr. Banibrata Mahanta, sir, to please take over the session.
Thank you, Sompurba, for that very generous introduction. And good afternoon to everyone. Greetings to Dr. Beena and Dr. Abhisarika. I would like to begin by thanking the School of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences, REVA University, and the Liverpool John Moores University for inviting me to speak on a topic of immense contemporary relevance, which is the representation of violence in literature and media. There is, how much ever we talk about it, there is still need for more and more in a more sustained way. In particular, I would like to thank Dr. Abhisarika Prajapati for asking me to speak on violence from the perspective of disability, the area I work in. I shall speak, as Sompurba said, on the topic disability and violence. Now, a very brief idea about violence as we understand it and the broader idea of oppression in general within which we place violence is probably, would be a good contextualization for how we move into what I plan to speak on. So violence, as we understand it in its broadest sense, may be understood as an interaction between two or more people or between two or more groups and communities in which one affects the other through words, through text, through behavior, in obvious ways or subtle ways, in ways that can lead to a variety of damaging consequences, ranging from death and physical injury to psychological and emotional harm, which can be both immediate and long term, and can also lead to manifestations of that violence in everyday life and living in terms of economic fallouts, in terms of access, in terms of so many other things. It could be one or more of these, it could be all of these together. And, violence then, to put it broadly, can be seen to manifest itself at various levels. They can range from the more evident forms like, the physical and the sexual, to apparently unrelated manifestations or distant manifestations like the economic, to more subtle forms like the lingual and psychological violence. Oppression, is a larger umbrella category within which we would place violence as one of its manifestations. Now, while the conference theme has, a very specific thrust, that is the representation of violence in literature and media, by which, as I understand, the organizers are interested in the dynamics of the depiction, the narration, the portrayal of violence in these areas, in these two areas, the ways in which, it communicates itself from the source to the target, to the reader or the viewer, and the analysis of violence and its theorization. I will take a slightly different track from what the title leads me into. I'll approach the topic in a way that goes backwards from one specific perspective, that is the perspective of disability, and backwards from these representations to trace the reasons behind why violence against disability is portrayed and understood the way it is. In doing so, in going backwards, I shall try to explore how disability is conceptualized, portrayed and comprehended across cultures, because it is cultures which birth these texts, and how these cultural mappings of disability determine its representations in literature and media, how these representations are shaped, how they are articulated, and how they are consumed. So there is a substratum which I shall try to explore. And in doing so, I shall do it from the specific perspective, from the broader perspective, not specifically of community violence, but community violence shall be, the broad, let us say, focus, the broad entry point into this discussion. And, I'll do it from a comprehensive general perspective rather than in any specific theoretical sense. Okay, in order to see how violence against communities manifests itself at various evident and latent levels. Now, I'll begin by trying to illustrate this through a few instances of how disability is represented across various cultural texts. Now, just as a sampling, these are not, representative, but just samples which try to foreground certain ideas which I shall then take up for discussion. So in order to just foreground the ideas that I have in mind, I take one instance each of how a literary text portrays disability, a film portrayal of disability, and a corpus of newspaper reportage to highlight these things that I have in mind. Okay, and I shall do it at a very summative level so that we can move on to the major discussion that I have in mind. Now, let us take up first the case of Dhritarashtra in the epic Mahabharata. That is my example of literary representation. Now, Dhritarashtra's blindness was the result of his mother's actions. Now, while Ambika was having intercourse with Vyasa, she found him too revolting to look at and closed her eyes during the act. This was, looked at as an insult to the holy man. Even the thought was, the thought that led to this action was an insult and led to a retributive action. Okay. So Dhritarashtra is said to have become blind because of this particular, incident. His blindness also led Dhritarashtra to being marginalized and disempowered. He is judged on the basis of what others think of him. I say this particularly in terms of, the denial of kingship to him. He is denied kingship because, the system around him thinks that he is not a complete person and therefore not a capable one. Questions of his agency or his ability are never brought into play. Can he do it? Can he not do it? That is not the question. The question is, the issue is that he is not a complete person. He is a disabled person. Okay, and therefore he cannot be given kingship. His blindness is also both literal and metaphorical. On one level, he cannot see. On another level, he is also seen to be blind to the actions of his sons, especially Duryodhana. And that is somewhere linked to his physical reality of blindness. Right. So, the literal and the metaphorical are also are both conflated. So this is the first instance, I want to narrate, which throws up 3 or 4 very, interesting problematics. The second example that I have in mind is a recent film which most of you must have seen, Guzarish, which stars Hrithik Roshan as the disabled protagonist. The film apparently is about euthanasia and its legalities. Okay, as well as, a kind of inquiry into the ethics of whether a person is right or wrong in taking his own life. Right. So 2 issues, the legal and the ethical. Now, when you see the film, most of you would have felt that it builds a very strong case for euthanasia. What I want to draw your attention to is that the protagonist is incidentally, maybe, let's for the time being accept that, disabled. Okay. And that seems to contribute to the logic of the film. What the film seems to say is that there is no point for the paraplegic protagonist to continue living. Now, what I want you to think about is that would the logic of the film still sustain if there was a non-disabled protagonist instead of a paraplegic one? Does the film, at a certain level, build on the narrative of a disabled life as not worth living? Does it suggest that euthanasia is all right for such a person? Is it making a general case or a specific case? That is what I want to draw your attention to. Does that tell you something about how disabled people are looked at in society? Just try and replace the paraplegic person with a non-disabled one, and you will realize that the story wouldn't take off in the first place. Okay, at least not the story in its present form. The disability of the protagonist is key to the framing of the narrative. So it is as much a narrative about euthanasia as it is about disability. The third instance that I want to take up is a set of observations about depiction in print media, or even in other forms of media. I take print. Now, the valorization of the disabled in terms of their achievements, in spite of their disability. Okay, that is always the context, the logic. Thus, propping them up as inspirations to all is the most common thing that you come across in newspaper reportage. The other thing that you come across is the sympathy and pity that is showered on disabled people in many other reports about disability. These seem to be the two major poles around which reporting about disability and disabled people moves. If a disabled person can do it, why can't an able-bodied person? Such narratives seem to ask, right? Or they suggest, if we look at the other extreme, that the lives of disabled people are full of suffering and pain, and disability is the reason for it. Now, just one more example before I move on to the other thing. One thing that I noticed particularly, since it is very recent, I would like to mention it, is that in reportage during the COVID pandemic, the emphasis was always on the difficulty disabled people faced in accessing healthcare or attending online academic or professional meetings, or how they could not keep pace with the changed demands of the times. Okay, the onus was always on the disabled people, their disabilities being the reason for this issue. Okay, now since we are doing an online meeting, and it would be in the fitness of things to explore this. The issue that I want to raise is, in this reportage, what is identified is that the difficulty that disabled people faced in attending online events was the result of their problems. Now, what we could think of is that whether it was solely their problem, or was it because of the fact that non-disabled employers, teachers, event organizers did not take their needs into account? Or could it, to think further, be because of the fact that technology is created by non-disabled people in accordance with the needs of the majority, and what disabled people could possibly need is also majorly determined not by them, but by non-disabled people. Right. Now, as I start off, so these three examples give you a kind of entry point into the various issues that I want to bring together in my analysis of, oppression and violence faced by disabled people. And before I start off, I'd like to emphasize that I use the term disabled people to refer to the community for a specific reason. The logic of my use of this particular term will hopefully become evident as I reach the end of my discussions. What is also important is to outline the conceptual framework that I've used to structure this talk. Now, this is also important in order to understand the examples that I shall now on use to illustrate my contentions. Now, I approach the whole issue of disability from the cultural constructivist perspectives. And how these constructions structure our meaning making, and the ways in which we respond to disabled persons, and how these constructions are rooted in and originate in a particular kind of knowledge of disability. My argument here is that, the constructions I set out to critique are a kind of epistemic violence. Knowledge about disability is constructed across cultures and across disciplines in terms of an ableist understanding of disability. That is, to put it in a nutshell, by ableist understandings of disability, I mean an understanding of disability that acknowledge the non-disabled as the knower and the producer of knowledge about disability and the disabled. And it is this set of cultural perceptions and disciplinary formations about disability that create the cultural textuality of, disability. And the dominant understandings of disability, the articulations of disability in the text that we have seen and in the many texts all around us, are the material effects of this textual conditioning. Okay. And their causes and consequences are epistemic violence and epistemic injustice. So I talked, I mentioned cultural perceptions and disciplinary knowledge. Let me begin with cultural perceptions to state a few very obvious things, things which, most of you would have experienced at an innate level are the things that I want to give word to. If you look at the history of cultural perceptions of disability, across the globe, you will find that the disabled body was almost always viewed with, a kind of apprehension, okay, even suspicion. And as societies evolved, as they became structured, at least in the earliest days, in terms of, religious ideas and ideals, religion became an important interpretive tool to, understand disability or to make meaning of disability. Disabilities were construed as having a cause which was largely individual, person-based, okay, or at the very most, it could be traced back to the immediate family. Or in some cultures, like the one we inhabit, it could also be traced back to the individual in previous births. Okay. And disability was said to occur due to wrongdoings, due to sins committed by the individual or by an immediate family member, due to a natural, it could have resulted from because the person was naturally inclined to evil, or because of moral lapses. Okay. Some conditions like schizophrenia were said to occur due to possession by the devil, by evil spirits, or due to witchcraft induced spells, and so on and so forth. Right. Now, when there are some religiously negative attributes that are used to interpret disability, the responses which these perceptions generated were also negative. So it could either be shame for the person, who was being interpreted thus, or it could be guilt, it could be remorse. So, disability for the disabled person becomes not the physical reality, but also something larger, cultural, in terms of how she or he looks at their self. It could also, it also led, actually, not could, it actually led other people to look at disabled people in terms of it being their misfortune or as their just deserts. They've got what they deserved, right? When we look at histories of schizophrenia and other mental health, issues, we find that it also led to the demonization of such persons. Okay, and largely, what we were talking about in newspaper reportage can be traced back to this idea of disabled people's tragic lives. Okay, and their sufferings and the pity that they therefore deserve, or the abhorrence that they therefore are worthy of. And at one level, at the other level, you know you also communicated with them not as persons, but you communicated with them through actions like charity, like alms, like services. Okay. Now, while I'm using the past tense majorly to locate it temporarily, that is, it has, this is how it was in the past. I'm sure you must all realize that these responses are rampant even in present times, right? So my use of the past has nothing to do with does not indicate that this does not happen now. It is just to locate it in the past, that this is how it happened in the pre-enlightenment times. Now, this also led to the larger acceptance of disability as destiny. Right. So people accepted disability. They were often, although they found difficulty negotiating it, they also at one level accepted it unquestioningly. Okay. Or at another level, the shame that was associated with disability led to disabled people hiding their disabilities, or they themselves being hidden from public view by their families. Okay, and at a more insidious level, it also led to social ostracization. Okay, disabled people or even their families were, in history, frequently cast out of the communities or the families that they inhabited and left to fend for themselves. And even earlier in Greek and Roman times, disabled children were actually, thrown on rocks and killed. Right. So resignation, acceptance, exorcism, persecution, and even death, as I just mentioned, were the possible ways for regulating or ending these these conditions. Sorry. So and this traditional perception also functioned as a kind of carrot and stick strategy. Okay, that was useful in regulating the behavior of the adherents of a particular religion. Okay, so you either got the carrot or the stick, and it made people fall in line with the dominant, let us say, uh, the dominant understanding of the good and evil within which it was structured. Now, over time, as reason and rationality gained primacy over religion, science replaced religion as the dominant ethic, and developments in medical sciences became the modern day equivalents of religious miracles. Okay. And when this happened, when science replaced religion, the religious perception of disability and the cultural violence that it led to was replaced by the construction of a body of knowledge from the scientific, or more specifically from the medical standpoint, that created an epistemological framework for understanding disability and the experience of the disabled in specific ways. And this is, a kind of construction that continues and dominates the area of disability even today. And while I talk about science and specifically medical sciences as responsible for the construction and perpetuation of this kind of attitude to disability, which I will just discuss, now. I also want to emphasize that it is not restricted to the medical sciences particularly, or to the sciences at large. It pervades all disciplines, right? So when you look at the construction of law, for example, the entire corpus of law is formulated on the concept of the reasonable man, right? When you look at the sciences, especially the human sciences, the life sciences, you find that it is predicated on the concept of the species typical body. When you look at social sciences, maybe something like political science or sociology, okay, you find that there is the construct of the normative citizen, which is central to all these disciplines. Now, what I'm trying to highlight is that this kind of epistemological framework, which generates itself with the advent of science, starts with the medical sciences and pervades, a wide range of disciplines, and even the humanities are not untouched by it. Now, this is helped along by certain facts. The fact that many disabilities can actually be medically, let us say, they have medical attributes, many disabilities. Okay, and the conviction of people in the ability of the medical sciences to cure people, to rehabilitate people with disabilities, which is still a dominant understanding, led to the growth and entrenchment of this kind of, knowledge and the circulation of this kind of knowledge about disability. So, looked at from this scientific perspective, disability was explained as a physical or cognitive deficiency that needed to be addressed again at the individual level. So really, the earlier cultural perceptions were also individual in their understanding and interpretation of disability. The sciences also located the problem at the level of the individual. Now, while the role of medicine in, managing pain or providing relief or intervening through operations in terms of saving lives cannot be denied. The larger metaphysic that I want to drive at is that this kind of a cure rehabilitation approach led to the institution of a normal body in terms of an acceptable level of human functioning. And everything that happened in a cure and rehabilitation was done with a view to help disabled people to overcome, to manage, and to transcend these afflictions and limitations, and to conform to or approach to this norm. Now, this word norm, which basically comes in from statistics and the bell curve, as some critics have rightly pointed out. So this is again, the word norm or the associated words like normal, normality, normalcy, or abnormal to go to the other end. All of these come in with statistics and how it looks at facts and figures. Number two, this idea of the norm is not a kind of term that is natural, okay, or non-scientific in the way that we understand it. Right. So that is why I stress that it comes in from science, and it comes in at a time when science started becoming the dominant logic of societies around the 1840s. So before the 1840s, the usage of the word normal in terms of constituting or conforming to or not deviating from what was regular or standard was not there. Right. So science comes in, the idea of the norm comes in, and then the idea of the norm is used to approach the experience of disability and disablement. Okay, and it is from there that a word like normal and associated words that I just mentioned come into usage and get naturalized to an extent that we think that something like normal would always have been there in society, not realizing that it is in the 1840s and 50s that it took on the kind of meaning that it is, that it now represents. Now, this kind of medicalized understanding of disability also coincided with the ascendancy of capitalism and the coming of industrialization. Right. Now, industrialization and capitalism together functioned in ways that led to human worth being assessed in terms of work value, in terms of profitability, okay, and in terms of who were productive and capable and who were unproductive and incapable. Right. Now, this structure fit in very nicely with the medical understanding of disability. Right. And so industrialism and capitalism, industrialization, sorry, and capitalism on one hand, and scientific understandings of disability on the other, became a kind of nexus that further, marginalized persons with disability. And this is the time when, disability came to be looked at in terms of being burdensome to society, disabled people being helpless, and therefore the need for them to be institutionalized. So we've all read about the madhouses and the prisons that Foucault talks about, and we've read about Dickens's pictures of poor houses. So these institutions became the place where these unproductive and incapable people were pushed into. Now, in agrarian times, there was at least a kind of integration of disabled people in society, in terms of the fact that they could exist alongside non-disabled people. But with the coming in of medical sciences and with the growth of industrialization and capitalism, this space also was challenged. So the simple proposition or the simple approach was that there was no place in society for disabled people. They could either be accommodated in society only if they had been cured through the intervention of medical sciences, and if they had been not, they were supposed to be institutionalized so that productive and capable people would not be affected by their presence in terms of caregiving, in terms of familial support, in terms of whatever, because productivity and capability were 9 to 5, were time bound activities. Now, this kind of an understanding of disability led to the idea of the normal becoming pervasive, not just in everyday life, but also in literature, in popular culture, in media. Okay, and led not just to non-disabled people internalizing these ideas and thinking about themselves in terms of lack and exclusion. Okay, which affected their idea of their selves and developed in them a kind of negative self-worth. Okay, uh, and all these exclusionary practices can be seen in terms of how society developed from there on. Now, disability theorists say that this kind of marginalization, oppression, this kind of epistemic violence that occurs happens through how disability then is used in, how we talk about disability. So when we talk about disability, if you look at all the words that are coined, if you look at their etymology, if you look at how and when in history they start, manifesting connotative traits apart from denotative ones, you will find that all of this falls into the kind of pattern that I've just tried to, share with you. So Simi Linton, for one, notes, she is a very prominent disability theorist, notes that the term disability itself contains the negative prefix dis, which is an ableist negation of the experience of disabled people. So what she says exactly, and I quote, is that this is the semantic reincarnation of the split between disabled and non-disabled people in society. And not just this, if you look at other negative prefixes that are used to narrate or articulate disability experiences like un, im, in, non, all of these are, manifestations of this same logic. Excuse me. Dr. Beena, I also need to ask you how much of time I have in hand.
It was, yeah, you can go on, sir. It is 1 hour and 15 minutes.
Okay, so I have time till.
You have time.
1 hour 15 minutes means, just to confirm with you, it will be 2:45, right?
Yeah.
Okay, fine.
No issues.
So then I'll conclude slightly before that so that there is time for some interaction as well. Now, apart from this, what you notice during these times, during the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, especially the later centuries, is that denotative words acquire subjective connotations. Okay. So they become associated with innuendos, with biases, with negative attitudes, with forms of feeling that are discriminatory, and then what happens is that words like deaf or dumb, okay, or blind become not just denotative usages but also connotative ones, and they realize themselves as phrases like deaf and dumb, okay, or in terms of metaphors like the blind leading the blind, or in terms of indifference such as turning a blind eye, or turning a deaf ear to something, or usages of words like invalid, which is as much today a physical condition as something of a negation of all that is worthwhile, all that is valuable. Or even the word dumb, for example, is not just about the inability to speak, but it also becomes associated with stupidity, right? Now, this kind of language usage therefore mounts a kind of lingual assault on disabled people's subjectivities, and it also affects them in ways that through the use of this language which they are socialized into, they acquire ideas of negative self-worth, of their own inability, their incapability, and so on. Now, apart from these words, the kind of words that come into English usage in terms of in terms of the growing medical understanding of disability are also very problematic. So you usually refer to disabled people through medical labels post this particular development in terms of their being patients, sick with something, afflicted by polio, suffering from something else, okay, or uh, as cases, and then what happens is that you look at them through a medicalized lens that stigmatizes the person, and that perpetrates a kind of psychological violence on the character by not letting them, in fact by restricting them, by not letting them go beyond uh, the non-disabled understanding of disability. Also important to notice in how we talk about people with disabilities is that we talk of them in terms of only their disabilities. So we talk of the blind, the deaf, the mentally retarded, which also makes me realize that I've missed out on a lot of cuss words that seem to be emerging from disability experiences. So for example, the words like crip, moron, okay, retarded, these are also used as abuses apart from being used to describe disability conditions, right? So when you are talking of the disabled, the deaf, the blind, you are denying people their individuality and looking at them only in terms of their disabilities. Now, this kind of lumping together of all members of a particular group, is a kind of psychological violence, I contend. Okay, and is the result of certain discriminatory attitudes and practices that affect, that have multiple, fallouts. Number one, it stereotypes them into particular ways of particular non-disabled ways of seeing and understanding, and therefore obscures their other characteristics, strengths, and abilities. Okay. Number two, it affects the way non-disabled people think about and interact with disabled people. And number three, it also harms disabled people because they also function within this language. They internalize its bias and prejudices. Okay, so this kind of lingual and as a result, psychological violence sometimes triggers negative self-fulfilling prophecies also, as June Cales, observes. Now, this is what I have in mind when I talk about how the construction and knowledge about disability perpetrates violence on disabled people. So the construction of this knowledge, the language in which it is framed, the ideas that they perpetrate are all mechanisms that oppress and commit violence against people with disabilities, deny them respect, and are therefore unacceptable. Okay, and the link. When I talk about language, it is to establish the link between perceptions and knowledge on one hand, and how lingual practices are a result of it, and how these lead to verbal and psychological violence. And why I repeatedly mention verbal and psychological violence is that the more obvious, the more manifest forms of violence, like the physical and the sexual, okay, are things which we can see, which we can comprehend. But these are more insidious forms of activity which need to be highlighted, which we need to be sensitive about in terms of how we perceive and how we communicate about and with disabled people. Right. Now, what is therefore needed, I argue, is not superficial makeovers in terms of language. So most people ask me, it is not right to say disabled or blind, right? We should use special or atypical or, different or words like that. But, these are just superficial makeovers. We do not need just superficial makeovers. We do not need euphemisms to talk about disability. So whether you are addressing somebody as deaf and dumb, or whether you are addressing them as different or special, both of them say that disability is the problem. One states it crudely, and the other communicates the same feeling by saying that, no, I will not use the D word, I will use something different, but the effect is the same. Now, what we need is an epistemic shift, and the disabled to adapt Spivak's well-known phrase about the subaltern have not been able to speak, and even if they have not been heard. Disabled ways of knowing and knowledge have not till recently been part of knowledge about disability. It is largely the non-disabled, epistemic construction that holds the center stage. Now, quickly, what kind of shift are we talking about, and what kind of, what can such a kind of shift do in terms of understanding disability and therefore mediating in the violence and oppression, both manifest and latent, that disabled people experience, is what I will conclude with. Now, as I have emphasized, earlier understandings of disability were comprehended disabled people as, comprehended disability as an individual condition. Right. So it was the person who was the focus, whether in cultural constructions or in medical and social sciences understandings. Now, as disability rights movements took off in the West, the epistemic shift was effected in terms of arguing for a critique of these positions in terms of attitudes, institutions, and physical barriers which prevent people with disability from maximum participation in society. So what people like Mike Oliver and the disability rights movements people, the DRM people argued is that the problem should not be located only in the individual. And they argued that disability is a social construct. Right. I'll just elaborate on this in a minute. The epistemic shift is marked by a switch, to quote Oliver, away from focusing on the physical limitations of particular individuals to the way the physical and social environments impose limitations on certain groups or categories of people. Now, when the focus shifts from the individual to the environment, it is held that it is the environment that disables a person. Now I'm also coming to the logic of why I use disabled and non-disabled. In a minute, non-disabled people, this approach argues, have constructed the world in a kind of majoritarian consensus in a way that the majority of the people who have similar abilities can function at ease, while people with different abilities, physical or cognitive, who are the minority, are faced with a complex of constraints and are hence disabled by society. So disabled here, the word that I use and I have been using throughout is the process by which a person with disability, a person who has any of these conditions, is unable to participate in society. I'll just give you a few examples to illustrate my point and then come to how, the change in meaning has led to the reconceptualization of disability from the perspective of disabled people. So, for example, if there is a sign language interpreter in a classroom such as ours, right, then the visually impaired person is not disabled, right? If there is facility for recording class notes in Braille, the hearing impaired person is not disabled. I'm extremely sorry. If there is a sign language interpreter in the classroom, the hearing impaired person is as able to understand and respond as any other person who is, not hearing impaired. I'm sorry about that. If there are facilities to record in Braille, okay, or to read in Braille as a matter of practice and not as an exception, the visually impaired person is as much equitably a part of the classroom as those who are not visually impaired. If there are lifts in buildings, if there are ramps which lead up to them, the person with orthopedic, impairment can go up to any classroom and enter any space, from the classroom to the washroom, and then he is also not disabled. They are disabled because society has been constructed and its infrastructure and its institutions have been constructed in ways that such people cannot become a part of this whole environment. If there are, hydraulic operated ramp buses, as there are now in many of the metros and at the airports, people who use wheelchairs can go up and come down them with ease, and they do not have to wait for help or do not have to think twice before traveling. So what was earlier commonly referred to as disability, the condition, is now characterized as impairment as a result of this rights movement in disability and as a result of the shift that I am arguing about, that I am discussing about. So earlier blindness was a disability, deafness was a disability, not having a limb was a disability. Now it is referred to as an impairment, right? So people can be visually impaired, hearing impaired, orthopedically impaired, and so on and so forth. And what society does to these impaired people so that they are segregated and marginalized and are not able to participate is the disablement. Okay. So the idea of disability and disablement have been turned on its head. So if people are disabled, it means that they are unable to participate in society because society is constructed in ableist ways. That does not take into consideration their impairments. Right. So impairment then is the loss or limitation of physical, mental, or sensory function, either on a long term or on a permanent basis. Disablement is the loss or limitation of opportunities to take part in the normal life of the community on an equal level with others due to physical and social barriers. The reassigning of meaning to the word disability is a powerful political step forward. It critiques society for how it has pinned the disabled into certain forms of thinking and seeing. And the solution to the problem, as in the case of racism or sexism or so many other similar experiences, is to change attitudes, social attitudes, to change social structures, to modify institutional setups, to mediate in technology in terms of a kind of discourse which changes the paradigm of dependence to one of independence, which shifts the attention from disability as an individual approach to disablement as a community approach. So the argument is that society and environment must change to accommodate people who have been marginalized on these counts and make provisions for integrating them equitably into society by making the necessary modifications. Right. To quickly put in, a last few words. Violence, then, to come back to what we started off with, can be active in its manifestations, in terms of some we have discussed. It can also be passive. It can be interpersonal. It can be community-based. It can be, as we've just seen, systemic, structural, institutional. These can all give rise to direct effects and indirect ones. Physical harm, social exclusion, abuse, trauma, and neglect are some of the more direct, discernible consequences. But if you look closely, there is, all this also leads to inaccessibility, unemployment, poverty as resultant effects. It is important, therefore, to look at violence in respect of disability as manifesting itself on multiple levels. social, economic, political, cultural, in terms of relations, in psychological impact, etc. And it is here that the epistemic break effected by this social conceptualization of disability from the perspective of the disabled becomes important. From the personal to the global, it helps understand the implications of experiences of disability and oppression that result from it, and thus interrogates the interactions between non-disabled and disabled people from the perspective of the latter, leading to an understanding of violences against people with disability, against disabled people in alternative, meaningful ways, opening up the possibility for successful interpretations into it. Right. So this is briefly what I had planned to talk about, not the entire thing, but I think I have run out of time and I would like to have a few interactions as well. So yes, this is where I stop.
Thank you so much, sir, for that insightful session. So first, I would like to take up two questions which have been posted in the chat box.
Okay.
So Dr. Chanda Yadav, he asks, in the 21st century, plenty of provisions have been made to facilitate the especially abled people, and many such people are shining in the games and professions. How the circumstances have changed for the disabled in the digital age?
Right. What you see as people shining in games and professions, is a very small part of what the media highlights, right? And this is where the media also comes in a big way. For every one person whom you see succeeding in games or, who is presented as a kind of hero figure, there are so many others who are struggling day in and day out in terms of access to basic needs, let alone, other things. Well, to answer your question, I would say that yes, circumstances have changed for the disabled in present times, in terms of the fact that there is now a legal provision, the RPWD Act, which intervenes into academics, into the professional sphere, into certain rights-based requirements that people have, into areas of transport and medical facilities, in a way that, if executed successfully, would be, wonderful. But then for all of this to be executed successfully, what needs to change is the mindset of non-disabled people. That is the tough part. The law in letter is one thing. The law implemented in spirit is an entirely different thing. Let us hope, as you seem to be so optimistic, Dr. Chanda, that, this bridge between letter and spirit, will be traversed soon. There is still, to put in a last quick word, a long distance to be covered.
Thank you so much, sir. There is one more question. Recently, we have read about some forms of violence that happened with the wrestlers who are far more powerful than others. Still, they are facing violence. Why?
I am very intrigued by the phrase wrestlers who are far more powerful than others. Like what exactly is this Chanda again, or is this somebody else?
I think it is she again.
Okay, can you just quickly, whoever has asked this question, if it is possible, I want to understand what you mean by wrestlers who are more powerful than others. Do you mean in terms of their physical capabilities, or in terms of how they are placed in society, or in terms of their being more empowered women or men than ordinary citizens? Yes, I think Chanda, Dr. Chanda Yadav just raised her hand if she wants to answer this. Yeah.
I request the organizers please unmute him or her. So that person can speak. I don't think
Okay.
able to do it, sir. I think what the person meant is in terms of, I think, physical power. Wrestlers, when we talk about wrestlers, I think we have this notion of wrestlers being physically powerful. I think the person has spoken just about that, what I feel.
Yeah, but I think we are also dealing with multiple forms of power here, and there is the political, there is gender involved, and then there are ideological battles that are being fought behind the scenes about it. So what I would say is that it is not such a simple thing that wrestlers are powerful and therefore they should not be facing violence. There is so much of intersectional realities which we need to contend with, right?
Exactly, sir. Thank you so much. We have one more question from Akshaya. The person is asking, what can be the theory of disability with reference to the psychic of a human? Is it related to the disorders like paranoid or anything else, sir?
Well, I'm not going to ask Akshay if he meant psyche of the human or psychic of the human. I'll assume that he says he means psyche, and answer accordingly. Yeah, because I think unmuting is a bit of a problem. So Akshay, what you are pointing towards is very important in the sense that you are bringing in the issue of intellectual disability, which is a much less talked of, less theorized aspect of the disability experience, because it is also the more problematic one. Because while other impairments like visual or hearing impairment or orthopedic can be addressed, can be seen, can be quantified in specific terms, intellectual differences cannot be so easily, let us say, calibrated. Right. Number one. Number two, when we are talking of intellectual, disabilities or neurodiversities, as the term that we now use, okay, we also need to, because you bring in paranoia, I also want to quickly point out that there is a difference between disease, disability, condition, and related terms, right? So a lot of mental health, uh, a lot of mental conditions. Some of them fall within the disability spectrum. Some of them fall, are treatable as diseases. So, it is also quickly to make this point important to make a distinction between them and not use them in overlapping ways. Right. So these 2 points then. One, yes, intellectual disability is definitely underwritten about. And number two, when we are talking about neurodiverse conditions, we need to differentiate between disease and disability, and also disease and disability on the one hand, and certain other conditions, neurodiverse conditions on the other.
Thank you so much, sir. We will take one more question. This is asked by Garima. Well, sir, you spoke of lingual violence that society does to the disabled. How would you describe lingual healing that can be directed towards them?
Right. So one way, one of the ways in which this can be done, of course, is in terms of the epistemic shift, in terms of what we mean by disability, disablement, impairment, and associated terms, right? So then when we are using, redeploying the same word in more empowering ways, we are actually highlighting the exclusion and marginalization of disabled people, the marginalization that disabled people face in society. And that is one way in which, uh, I think we are talking back to earlier loaded terms and usages that were used to discriminate against the disabled. Number two, you know, uh, I don't know about how effective it can be in terms of healing, but I do feel that a little bit of sensitivity in terms of how we use this language can be, very useful in terms of, not perpetrating further lingual violence on them. Okay, so our conscious avoidance of certain terms and our conscious use of certain other terms could be strategies that could help build bridges. Healing or not healing, is a larger question which would result from it. Right. Sampurba, yeah.
Thank you. So one more question, sir. How would you? This is asked by Harika Ninavarapu. So this person is asking, sir, how would you describe a disabled psyche of an individual succumbed or subjected to violence?
Okay. Again, this is a slightly contentious question in the sense that, if you are talking of a non-disabled person who has been subjected to violence and has therefore become disabled, then I understand your question. If you are using disabled psyche as a metaphor, I would like to point out, since we've been talking about lingual violence, let us all understand that using disability as a metaphor is, not acceptable, because it kind of does not let the sanctity of the disabled experience stay what it is. Okay, so you talk of women being disabled by a gendered society, you talk of the psyche being disabled by violence, you are metaphorizing disability and therefore trivializing the experience of the disabled person per se, right? So if that is how you have used disabled psyche, Harika, this is my position on it. Number two, if you are, a better way to talk about it would be trauma. Okay, would be, the condition per se rather than a metaphorical use of the term. I guess that is it. Yeah.
Okay, sir. Fantastic. Okay, now next question is from Nehad Kanis Fatima. She asks, how much do you think an epistemic shift can benefit disabled people who face practical and policy-based discrimination?
See, the entire idea of accessibility in infrastructure is based on this epistemic shift. So I'd say that it will, policy-based discrimination is directly affected by this epistemic shift and the policies that are subsequently formulated in terms of, let us say, accessible spaces, in terms of, job reservations, in terms of,
Excuse me, sir, you are not audible.
I think there is some power cut.
Yes, some network problems.
And I'm in darkness, but I'm connected on the phone. I'm sorry. Yeah, just give me a minute. Yeah.
Yes, sir, sure.
Yeah, sorry about the unexpected power cut, but I guess this will do for the time being.
Sure, sir. You're very much seen.
Yeah. Right. So that is about the policy-based part. So a lot of what is happening post the DRM, the disability rights movement, and the things that have accrued as a result of it, including how much the UN has taken up the issue, and through the UN these developments are getting into all the different parts of the globe, including India. If there wasn't such pressure, if there wasn't such a compulsion in a certain way, I'm sorry to use the word, to actually take these steps forward, this would have taken a lot more time, Nehat. Right. Practically, I just have one observation, I'll tell you. Feminism as a movement has been going on for a lot many more years than the disability rights movement. And how much ever has been done, a lot more still needs to be done. And it's early days yet for the disability rights movement. So we can wait in hope and contribute our bit to it. Right.
Thank you so much, sir. I'll take up the last question by Priyanka Bharali. She is asking, sir, as you also said about the use of the term, some people call them disabled people, some people call them differently abled, people with disability, sorry, specially able, Divyang, etc. But the disability rights activists argue for the use of disabled, considering it their identity and accepting it. What do you think about it?
Right. So I think I'll just repeat what I already said. I've made my position fairly clear. I subscribe to the use of the word disabled in terms of its present usage by disability rights activists as, persons with impairment being disabled by society. Right. And my vote is for impairments as descriptions of physical, mental, or cognitive conditions, and disabled in terms of the discrimination and marginalization that such people face on account of social, institutional, attitudinal barriers.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. Great to hear such insightful talk on this topic. And I'm sure everybody has gained a lot of information and knowledge on this particular topic about disability and violence. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Beena G, moderator of today's session, to give her benevolent remarks to make it more comprehensive.
Before I start that, am I permitted to ask you a question, sir?
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Okay, I wanted to know this, that when we talk about violence, particularly in the context of our conversation today, disability and violence, the world of the disabled is very intricately connected with caregivers. And they share a very intimate world because of the dependability factor. So on one hand, when we talk about violence, yes, the violence that is triggered, all forms of violence, all levels of violence, triggered towards the disabled. While on the other hand, though it is not intentional, in certain cases, the caregivers are also receivers of violent manifestations of the disabled person. So I just wanted to know a little about that, because I don't know if I'm right in saying that using the word violence, but then the caregivers and the disabled together, I think it's a very complex world. and there can be exclusion that is experienced by the caregivers from the societal perspective on one hand, while on the other, in certain conditions, they become the receivers of, some form of violence, though unintentional, from the disabled person.
Right. First of all, thank you, Dr. Beena, for asking me this question. And as a caregiver myself for my daughter, I speak from this position in terms of the complexities that they embody. Number one, when you are engaged as a caregiver to a person with disability, you are always negotiating between, the abilities, or let us say the realities more appropriately, of the person whom you are caring for versus societal expectation. Right. And that is a continuous tightrope walk. Right. So, for example, as a caregiver, you have to negotiate with academic expectations in school setups or in educational institutions in general, and in terms of how, in this very performance-driven world, you cannot, as much as you try, create equitable space for a person with disability. Number two, your handling of the disabled person is also mediated by your own subjectivity. Okay. That subjectivity could be a dominant ableist understanding of disability, wherein you think that anything that is not happening is a lack, a loss, a failure, or an let us say lack of motivation, and so you approach it in a very let us say aggressive way also at times. If you accommodate the needs of the person with disability, you have a more compassionate, a more empathetic, I'm extremely sorry, a more empathetic understanding of, the requirements and the possibilities that are there within the person. Right. So, but, as human beings, it is very difficult to make watertight categories among between the two, and one frequently spills over into the other, and that is another cause for tension. The part that you mentioned in terms of let us say social value judgments about disability, about how disabled children should be kept in, they should not be allowed to mix with non-disabled children. That is another form of interactional violence that caregivers have to mediate in. And within confines, certain kinds of disabled people are violent, aggressive in their behavior. Okay. And if you are a caregiver, and particularly if you are an informal caregiver, a professional caregiver is more equipped to handle so many things. As an informal caregiver, you become a kind of let us say absorber of a lot of these things, which come at a certain cost to the caregiver. And if you factor in gender into that whole perspective, you find that it becomes so much more complicated. Right. I hope I have been able to respond to your question in terms of the issues that are there. I know this is not an answer, but just a kind of...
Yeah, that I was curious on that. Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you so much. Okay, this has been a very insightful, to sound very cliched. I repeat that this has been a very insightful session, Dr. Mahanta, and I'm sure each one of us has a lot of takeaways, from this session. Gone are the days when, we have moved away from the sin, curse, redemption, retribution trajectory, of disability that was portrayed some time back, particularly in the Hindi films. From that to the fact that today we are talking, there is an interaction on disability and violence. We have come, I would say, some way, but then I agree with you on that count that we still have a long way to go. Having said that, the world of disabled is a very highly marginalized one, and the relationship between ableism, disability, and violence is a terrain not very frequently encountered in a very majoritarian ableistic world. So it requires very sensitive treading onto this complex landscape of disability. But then, having said that, and like I rightly agree with the speaker when sir, you said the portrayal of disability right from the pages of mythology in terms of the reference to Dhritarashtra that you wonderfully made to the present news reportage. And as far as films in particular are concerned, I think we all agree that there is a bipolar oscillation between a highly romanticized world of the portrayal of the disabled through some films on one hand, and on the other, representing them in terms of the saga of silence, suffering, and sacrifice. So between these two poles rests the real marginalized, disempowered, and I think quiet world of the disabled or the differently abled. Disabled, I come back to the word after having listened to you. And it's very important, and it's very, very relevant that there is a dialogue like this that has opened up, of course, a long way to go, with the dependability factor, where both the disabled and the caregivers form a very, like I said, a very intimate world. And caregiving, like you said, can be an informal one, or it can be an institutionalized one itself. However, amidst the relationship between disabled and the ableist world, it is relevant for us to understand that disabled bodies and beings as subjects, as well as objects of desires, of dreams, of emotions, of erotic desires. And here I would probably make a reference to the film Margarita with a Straw, which I think made a big leap in terms of the perspective of looking at a disabled community or people or person as bodies with desires and sexuality. So along with this, there are also umpteen representations in films, again, coming back to Guzarish, with this, debate wherein the right to live with dignity versus the right to die with dignity. So there are films that, that project both. And like very rightly said, it's important for the majoritarian ableistic world to look at it from the empathize and look at it from the shoes of the disabled person, for policies, for practices to be more relevant and productive. So multiple aspects make this a near unexplored terrain in terms of a requirement wherein a paradigm shift or an epistemic shift is required. And, I end on this, huge learning in terms of the definition of disabled that we got at the end of the session, where the paradigm itself changes. The paradigm of dependability, needs to move towards independence, because disability is a condition that we or the majoritarian able-bodied society makes the other person. So the very definition of disabled, the onus lies on the majoritarian ableistic world. And I think with this paradigm shift in terms of understanding, there is a very innate need for the majoritarian ableistic world to have to rethink and recalibrate the way the entire community of disabled people are looked at and interacted with. So having said that, I think in terms of theorizing also the experiences of the disabled need to be looked at from a very different perspective that it has been looked at, so far, because it is, I think, always a very, it has always been a very ableistic, majoritarian, dominant perspective, which probably defeats its very purpose. So having said that, I think it has been a very, very insightful, interaction that we have had with Dr. Mahanta, and I'm sure that all of us, take back a lot of learnings and newer understandings of our, the very term disabled. Thank you so much for that.
Thank
you
you,
so much.
ma'am. I really appreciate how you picked up all the important points that I wanted to put across and communicate them. Lovely listening to you at the end.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. To quote the bard, all's well that ends well, we have come to the end of a very insightful session. I now would like to propose the vote of thanks. On behalf of the School of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences, I would like to extend my gratitude to Dr. Banibrata Mahanta, sir, for sharing his valuable time with us. Thank you, sir. I would also like to thank our moderator, Dr. Beena G, ma'am, for bringing life to the session and making it so meaningful and comprehensive. Thank you, ma'am. My sincere thanks goes to our Director of the School of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences, Dr. Payal Datta Chaudhary, ma'am, for extending immense support for the FDP. I would also like to thank our Chancellor, sir, Dr. P. Shamraju, sir, and Vice Chancellor, Dr. B. Dhanamjaya, sir, for their continuous guidance. My heartfelt thanks goes to the Research Coordinator, Dr. Abhisarika Prajapati, ma'am, who made this FDP possible. I convey my thanks to all those who have joined the session today. Last but not the least, I would like to thank all the participants for their enthusiasm in joining and being with us throughout the session. Thank you once again for making this event a success. Take care and stay safe.
Thank you. I'll take my leave.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. I request all the participants to appear on the screen so that we can freeze this movement quickly. I hope you all understand the technical issues to handle so many people at the same time. That is why I disabled the audio and video. Some of you can quickly come on the screen. We can take a picture together. Yeah. Very happy to see all these faces. Probably I was interacting from a long time. Thank you so much, everyone. Now the time has come to join the next keynote session. I know that today is a very hectic day. It's a long day. Now the next session will start sharp at 3:30 on the topic Gender and Juvenile Justice. Thank you, everyone.